It is just after 1 o'clock in the morning on July 25, 1943, and the sky above Hamburg has gone wrong. Below, in the concrete bunkers of the Kammhuber Line, German radar operators are staring at screens filled with a blizzard of light. Somewhere out there, nearly 800 British bombers are converging on Germany's second city, yet the screens insist there are thousands. The great Würzburg dishes, designed to track a single aircraft with pinpoint accuracy and feed that position to the master searchlights and the heavy guns below, are seeing ghosts. The master searchlights, the brilliant blue-tinged beams that should be locking onto individual bombers and holding them, blinded for the guns to finish, are instead wandering the night sky like men groping in a darkened room. Night fighter controllers shout into their microphones, trying to vector their crews onto contacts that dissolve the moment anyone looks at them properly. Somewhere above, a Lancaster crewman leans into the flare chute and posts out a bundle of tinfoil strips, exactly as he was briefed, 1 bundle a minute, timed on his wristwatch. He has no real idea what it does. He has just been told it works. It works. Of the 791 aircraft that set out for Hamburg that night, only 12 failed to return. For a city this size, defended by one of the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems on Earth, that loss rate is almost unthinkable. A defensive network that had been built, layer upon layer, for the better part of 4 years, has been switched off in a single night, not by brute force, but by deception. The device responsible weighed less than an ounce, cost almost nothing to manufacture, and looked to anyone who picked it up off a German street the next morning like rubbish. It was tinfoil. And for one extraordinary summer, it made the most advanced radar-guided defense system in the world completely, helplessly blind. This is the story of how a small group of British scientists, working in requisitioned country houses on the south coast of England, took the simplest material imaginable and used it to dismantle Nazi Germany's night sky. It is a story about searchlights that could not find their targets, guns that fired at nothing, and a war fought not with bombs alone, but with confusion, deliberately and carefully engineered. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand how desperate the problem had become by 1943. Bomber Command had spent the first years of the war laboring under a brutal and humiliating truth. Most of its bombs were landing nowhere near their targets. An internal study, the Butt Report of 1941, had found that only around 1 bomber crew in 5 was dropping its bombs within 5 miles of the intended target on a given raid, and that figure dropped even lower over heavily defended German industrial cities. Night flying, dead reckoning navigation, blackout conditions, and inexperienced crews had combined to produce a bombing campaign that was, by any honest measure, missing. The German response to the early stages of this air war had been to build, methodically and with considerable engineering skill, a defensive network that closed the gap between British ambition and German vulnerability. At its heart sat the Kammhuber Line, named for General Major Joseph Kammhuber, a belt of radar stations and night fighter boxes stretching across the Low Countries and into Germany itself. Each box, nicknamed a Himmelbett, or 4-poster bed, after the elaborate German beds with their canopies, combined a long-range Freya radar for early detection with a pair of precision Würzburg radars, one tracking the incoming bomber, one tracking a German night fighter, with a ground controller talking the fighter onto the bomber's tail using the 2 plotted positions. Where fighters could not be vectored in time, the system fell back on flak batteries and master searchlights, themselves cued by radar, capable of fixing a single aircraft in a blinding cone of light and holding it there for the guns or for a waiting fighter to finish the job. By 1943, this system had grown formidable. Hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft batteries ringed German cities, their crews trained to fire on coordinates handed to them directly by radar rather than by eye. Searchlight regiments worked in coordinated clusters, a master light locking onto a target with radar guidance while several slave lights swung in to join it, turning a single aircraft into a brilliantly illuminated target visible for miles, held steady in the beam long enough for flak crews to find their range or for a waiting night fighter to close in for the kill. To a bomber crew caught in that cone of light, the experience was reportedly less like being spotted and more like being seized. The cockpit suddenly flooded with a hard blue-white glare bright enough to read a map by 1943, this system had grown formidable. Hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft batteries ringed German cities, their crews trained to fire on coordinates handed to them directly by radar rather than by eye. Searchlight regiments worked in coordinated clusters, a master light locking onto a target with radar guidance while several slave lights swung in to join it, turning a single aircraft into a brilliantly illuminated target visible for miles, held steady in the beam long enough for flak crews to find their range or for a waiting night fighter to close in for the kill. To a bomber crew caught in that cone of light, the experience was reportedly less like being spotted and more like being seized. The cockpit suddenly flooded with a hard blue-white glare bright enough to read a map by, every instinct screaming to dive or bank away while knowing that sudden movement might do nothing but confirm the gunner's aim. Losses among RAF bomber crews were already climbing towards levels that, sustained, no Air Force could realistically absorb. Some squadrons were losing aircrew faster than training schools at home could produce replacements, a grim arithmetic in which a young man's statistical odds of completing a full tour of operations were, by some calculations, worse than even. The mathematics of the campaign were turning against Bomber Command, and everybody from Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris downwards knew it. The frustrating part was that the British had known, for well over a year, of a way to blind this entire system. The problem was not technical ignorance. It was fear. The answer had emerged, almost by accident, from a piece of practical physics so simple it embarrassed the scientists who eventually weaponized it. Radar works by sending out a pulse of radio energy and listening for the echo bounced back by a solid object, in this case, an aircraft. But radio waves do not care whether the object reflecting them is a Lancaster bomber or a strip of metal foil, provided that strip is cut to roughly half the wavelength the radar is using. Cut enough strips to the right length, release them into the air in their thousands, and a radar screen will show not one aircraft but an entire phantom fleet, an undifferentiated, drifting cloud of false echoes through which no operator can pick out the real threat. The work of turning this principle into a usable weapon fell to the Telecommunications Research Establishment, Britain's secret radar laboratory, based first at Worth-Matravers near Swanage in Dorset, and later relocated inland to Malvern in Worcestershire. Within its countermeasures group worked a Welsh physicist named Joan Curran, who had joined the laboratory in 1940 alongside her husband, the physicist Sam Curran. It was Curran who, working through 1941 and into early 1942, conducted the systematic trials that turned a theoretical possibility into a battlefield-ready device. She experimented first with wires, then with larger sheets closer in size to notebook paper, testing how each performed against the frequencies used by German radar, before settling on a final design. Strips of aluminium foil, roughly 1 to 2 centimeters wide and 25 centimeters long, bundled into compact packets that a crewman could simply post through an aircraft's flare chute. According to her husband's later account, Curran personally cut the first batches of foil at home using household scissors before arranging a live test, dropping the strips from an aircraft flying out of Christchurch Aerodrome while colleagues watched the effect unfold on radar screens on the ground. The result, he wrote afterwards, was extraordinary. The screens lit up as though an entire fleet of aircraft had appeared from nowhere. The code name given to this device was Window. To grasp why it worked so well, it helps to think about what a radar operator is actually looking at. A Würzburg set sends out a narrow beam of radio energy and waits for it to bounce back off something solid, plotting that echo as a single bright dot, the aircraft, on an otherwise dark screen. The operator's entire skill lies in tracking that one dot as it moves. Window strips, cut to roughly half the wavelength of the radar they were meant to deceive, behaved electrically almost exactly like a small aircraft, each strip throwing back its own bright, convincing echo. Drop a single strip, and the screen shows one extra dot, easily dismissed as interference. Drop several thousand, tumbling and drifting at slightly different speeds and altitudes across several miles of sky, and the screen dissolves into what one wartime account described as a blizzard. Indistinguishable individual contacts merging into a single, shapeless mass of false returns. Imagine trying to follow one specific person's voice in a football stadium the moment 40,000 people start shouting the same sentence at slightly different volumes. The genuine signal is still technically present, and the plan was given the operation name Gomorrah. What happened next was as close to total system failure as any defensive network experienced in the war. On the night of 24th to 25th July 1943, as the bomber stream approached, crews began releasing window at the briefed rate, one bundle roughly every minute, timed by stopwatch through the flare chutes of their aircraft. German ground radar operators watching their Würzburg screens fill with what appeared to be an impossibly large incoming force found themselves unable to isolate any single, genuine target from the false echoes surrounding it. The master searchlights, which depended on exactly this radar data to lock onto an aircraft and hold it in their beam, swept the sky without finding anything to fix on, the light wandering uselessly across cloud and empty air while real bombers passed beneath, unilluminated. Anti-aircraft guns, cued by the same contaminated radar picture, fired into sectors of sky that were empty or held their fire entirely for want of any solid target to aim at. Airborne night fighters, vectored by ground controllers who could no longer distinguish a genuine contact from a foil-generated phantom, hunted through the dark and largely came home empty-handed. Some bomber crews would later report flak and searchlight activity continuing around them, described as numerous but ineffective, sound and light without consequence. Records from the German side where they survive describe controllers in a state approaching panic, radar operators reporting fleets of aircraft that simply could not exist given Britain's known bomber strength, and a defensive system trained for years to respond to a single, trackable threat suddenly presented with thousands. Exact internal accounts from individual Himmelbett stations that night are incomplete, many records lost or destroyed in the chaos that followed, but the aggregate result is beyond dispute. Of the bomber force dispatched, only 12 aircraft failed to return, a loss rate dramatically below what crews had come to expect over a heavily defended German target. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, would later recall the shock inside the Air Ministry, admitting that the British had used some new device that prevented the anti-aircraft guns from finding their bombers, and that if the success of that first Hamburg raid could be repeated against 4 or 5 other German cities, Germany's war production might simply collapse. The German answer, when it came, proved instructive by its limitations rather than its strength. Duple, the German equivalent, was used against Britain only 6 weeks later, on the night of 7th to 8th October 1943, in strips cut to roughly 80 centimeters by under 2 centimeters, tuned to disrupt the longer wavelengths used by certain British radars, and again during the so-called mini-blitz of early 1944, codenamed Operation Steinbock. But by then the strategic picture had reversed itself entirely. Britain's night fighter force, equipped with increasingly capable centimetric radar that proved considerably more resistant to simple foil disruption than the longer wavelength Würzburg and Freya sets it was up against, was simply too large and too well organized for the small German bomber force attempting to use Duple to exploit. Theoretically sound, the German effort was, in practice, doomed from the outset by the sheer disparity in scale between a shrinking Luftwaffe bomber arm and an expanding RAF night fighter force that could absorb the deception without losing its grip on the wider battle. The Americans, working independently and largely unaware of the British program, arrived at much the same technique slightly later in the war, developed by astronomer Fred Whipple and naval engineer Merwin Bligh. Early American trials initially failed for a strikingly mundane reason. The foil strips stuck together in clumps as they fell, drastically reducing the radar reflecting surface area and producing little of the desired effect. Bligh's fix was characteristically elegant, a dispensing cartridge that forced the strips to rub against one another as they were ejected, building up a static electrical charge that caused them to repel one another in the air and disperse into a proper cloud rather than a falling clump. The underlying principle, in other words, was discovered independently on at least 3 sides of the conflict: British, German, and American, a reminder that the physics involved was never the genuinely difficult part. What separated Britain's use of it from the others was timing, sustained political nerve, and the fact that it was unleashed in concentrated force against a defensive network meticulously built around the single assumption that radar would always tell the truth. The material impact of window is, in some respects, easier to measure than its psychological impact, and historians remain careful about separating the two. The bomber loss rate over Hamburg that week stands as solid, documented fact. What is harder to quantify is the broader shock the raids delivered to German confidence in their own technology, a confidence that had underpinned years of investment in an integrated, radar-driven air defense system now shown to be vulnerable to a few pence worth of household foil. The destruction inflicted on Hamburg itself during Operation Gomorrah, through the firestorm that followed the bombing and the area attacks that accompanied it, was severe enough on its own terms to provoke significant changes in German strategy, with the Luftwaffe redirecting a substantial proportion of its fighter strength away from frontline duties and back towards the defense of the homeland in the weeks that followed. How much of that reallocation can be attributed specifically to window, as opposed to the bombing itself, is something the historical record does not allow anyone to state with total precision, and reasonable historians continue to weigh the two effects differently. What is clear is that window did not remain a one-off trick. Less than a year later, the same foil strips played a quieter but equally consequential role during the Normandy invasion, when window drops over the English Channel, carried out as part of Operation Taxable on the night of 5 to 6 June 1944, were used to simulate on German radar the appearance of an entire Phantom invasion fleet, helping to sow doubt in German minds about exactly where the real landings would fall. The technology that had blinded Hamburg's searchlights went on to help conceal the largest amphibious invasion in history. Versions of window, refined and modernized, remain in active use by military aircraft today, deployed automatically from cartridges whenever a modern aircraft's systems detect it as being tracked, a direct descendant of strips once cut by hand with household scissors in a Dorset cottage. Surviving examples of wartime window bundles, along with related radar equipment recovered from German installations, can today be seen in collections including the RAF Museum and at the site of the former Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern, now preserved in part through local heritage efforts that keep the story of its origins alive. So return for a moment to that night sky above Hamburg, to the searchlight operators swinging their beams across cloud and emptiness, hunting for an aircraft that radar insisted should be there, and never quite finding it. Return to the radar screens filled with a blizzard of false echoes, to controllers shouting orders that sent fighters chasing phantoms through the dark, to guns firing into sectors of sky containing nothing but foil and falling air. None of it happened because of some vast new weapon, some breakthrough in metallurgy or electronics that took years and fortunes to perfect. It happened because of strips of tinfoil, cut to a precise length, dropped from a flare chute on a stopwatch. That is, in the end, the most striking thing about window. It did not outbuild the German air defense network, and it did not outfight it. It simply lied to it, more convincingly than anyone on either side of the war had quite dared believe possible, until a Welsh physicist with a pair of household scissors proved otherwise. The Kammhuber Line had been built to see everything. For one critical summer, it was made to see everything that wasn't there, and nothing that was. The searchlights kept searching. They simply never found what they were looking for.